Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Sonia. I didn't know there were TEDx coaches. Is it too late to change my mind? I'll go next year after having some coaching. Well, thank you. As a teacher, I have a dream, and I think it's shared by many people, and that is that every student is successful in their life. And I hope this for my students. I hope this for all students. Now, this dream might seem ambitious. It might seem too big to be realized in my lifetime. But if you're not dreaming about something that can't be achieved in your lifetime, maybe you're not dreaming big enough. So when I think about lifelong learning, I hope that every student's learning experience at whatever age or level can be something that is really meaningful to them, something that's interesting, engaging, and something that's ultimately useful to them. Now, I'm a teacher, so I have to confess that not all of our schooling meets these criteria, at least not yet. So I have to make some kind of diagnosis. After all, I am a doctor, but I'm not a medical doctor, I'm an education doctor. So I'll make a little diagnosis about why our schooling doesn't do a better job at preparing our students for lifelong learning. And one reason is that the institution of schooling was developed and evolved a very long time ago. This is a page from a textbook that was used in the United States before it was the United States. It began in about 1690 to be used throughout New England, and it continued to be used for over 150 years. They didn't change the textbook. And that's the age, that's the time in which schooling developed. And even now, in 2018, we still have a lot of vestiges of this age-old institution. So this is really fun to check out the words of 4 syllables and 5 syllables and some poetry here. I especially like this one, "The idle fool is whipped at school." So times have definitely changed. And we all know this, the world is changing so fast, and it has been changing so fast that an institution which developed when the same textbook could be used for 150 years can't always serve our needs in a world that is changing constantly. But another reason that we aren't doing better in schools to prepare students for lifelong learning is that knowledge itself is changing. Our understanding about knowledge and the flood of new information that we're constantly inundated by. So for example, if you're at university here and you're a chemistry major and you went to our fine library and you read 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for a year, every new thing that was published on chemistry, after the first year, you would probably be about 4 or 5 years behind on your reading. There's just too much. So we're entering this age, we try to deal with this by specializing, by narrowing our field, by focusing more and more. So we sometimes say that in an age of specialization, people are learning more and more about less and less until they know absolutely everything about absolutely nothing. So what we need in this day is judgment. Now, I like this quote from the dean of Harvard Medical School, who used to tell his incoming students every year, half of what we're about to teach you in medical school, this one of the finest medical schools in the world, is wrong. The trouble is, we don't know which half. And I think this is very profound because he's acknowledging right at the beginning of medical school that this is not about knowing everything. It's about developing good judgment. So another problem we face, which is closer to home and closer to my experience, is this, that in the curriculum in schools all over the world, we have this paradigm. We have this concept that the best way to prepare students for the future is to prepare them for everything. And so we have the idea of the every student, and we try to teach every student everything. But every one of our students is absolutely unique. And so this is a bit like trying to pack your bags to travel everywhere in the world because you don't know where you're going. And so this is a list of some of the recommended text types that English teachers teach in Hong Kong. Now, I was a secondary English teacher in Hong Kong for many years. I taught more than 1,000 students, and I would dare say that there's not 1 or 2% of my students that really need all these text types or couldn't learn them later in life when they need them. So it's very overwhelming. Now, in fact, my students were more interested in text types that were not even on that list. They're interested in social media, they're interested in Facebook and Instagram, and here I'm trying to catch up with some of my students by getting a good angle on this photo for my Instagram page. So what is the alternative? One of the alternatives that I have discovered only recently, which has been part of my lifelong journey as a teacher, is to understand life as a story. That every one of us has a story. And the question we have to ask is, who is the author? So Aristotle said, plot is character in action. It's all about how you live, how you develop your character, and who is making these choices about who you will be. And I think you know my answer. It should be yourself. You should be the author of your own life. So a Writing Your Life course or a reflection curriculum is primarily about reflection. After all, the eyeball sees by reflection. And so we should teach our students to reflect on their own lives and their own place in the world. So fortunately, in this curriculum that I showed you, there actually is a place for this. And if you read this list very carefully, you can see autobiographies is already there. So I was very happy to find that. And I have to say that there isn't a lot of reflection or text types on this list, but there are 1 or 2. The autobiographies and I think diaries are also wonderful to help students develop the habit and the experience of continuous, close, careful reflection. Okay, so I should include a little bit of my own autobiography, since that's what we're talking about. And this is my first grade class, so in a traditional public high school in the United States. And so this is the beginning of my lifelong learning journey. That's me sitting in the front row. For some reason, brown was always my favorite color. And so you can see I'm dressed out in brown there. Now, in this space, after that first picture, before we get to this one, of course I had my own learning journey. But one of the important landmarks on that learning journey is when I began to look around and see the great diversity of people in the world and all of the profound differences in terms of beliefs and cultures and history and governments. Yet I decided that more important than these differences is the oneness, is the commonalities, is the unity of humanity. So this belief was inspired by the teachings of Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith. And it empowered me to think about all of us as one family in the world. So, well, I'd grown up and was educated in Virginia, so I really didn't know very much about the world. So for my first full-time teaching job, I asked the US government to send me to the place in the world which was most different from the United States. And they sent me to Papua New Guinea. So this is where I was first a teacher. And it was very interesting to learn something about it. I went to the library and I got out the books that I could find on Papua New Guinea. There weren't very many. And the titles of 2 of them were Blood is Their Language and The Last Cannibals. So I was a little nervous going to this place, but I want to tell you that my belief in the family of mankind was so affirmed when I realized teachers in Papua New Guinea, students in Papua New Guinea, essentially they're just like my teachers and students and friends in the United States. And some of my closest friends and brothers are still living in Papua New Guinea. And we're in close touch 30 years later. So this led to a kind of exploration of the world. This is the Baha'i World Center in Israel, and here we are today. So I've been through China and now here in Hong Kong, and I feel very much at home in the world. And in fact, my family is a small representation of that diversity, my lovely wife and son. And so we're half Chinese. My children are both 50% Chinese. My wife is Chinese, so half my family is Chinese. Okay, so this principle in unity in diversity was something that became part of my lifelong journey, and it's shown in the faces of Baha'is from all over the world. It's shown in the houses of worship that are on every continent in the world, that these beautiful houses of worship all have a central dome and 9 entrances facing every direction as a symbol of unity and openness, but you can see they also reflect the beautiful diversity of our architectural traditions everywhere. Well, this is just a little bit about my autobiography, and it's very important to realize in teaching that we have to let go of this principle of teaching as instructing or giving knowledge. This is not what it's all about. I'm just sharing a little bit of my autobiography, but I want each one of my students to find their own beliefs, not to necessarily believe what I believe, but to be inspired by others, by a wide range of cultural and literary traditions, and to find their own belief. The only recommendation that I would give is to believe in and commit yourself to something which is bigger than yourself. And this will give your life meaning. So whether it's community service, the environment, your family, or the next generation of students, because I know many of you will also be teachers, this is something that will really give meaning. Okay, so how do we do it? We have to be practical. And the idea of teaching reflection is not easy. It's a bit like teaching creativity. If you tell someone how to do something to be creative, you see the paradox. It's not creative for them. And so one of the things we've learned is that you have to give space. You have to give a place where people have permission and feel free and have license to be creative, and then try to find some inspiration, and then discover for themselves what is creativity. Reflection is the same, that I can't tell you what to reflect on about your life. We have to provide a space. And thanks to some help from the Australian Writing Your Life professor, Richard Freeman, I got some guidance, and we started this class here at the Education University. And this is our first class, and thanks to all of those who joined as guinea pigs in our first class. So we first start by reading some of the great life writers, like Viktor Frankl, who wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." So he has a profound life story about man's search for meaning. And Anne Frank, of course, who wrote, among many other beautiful things, "Despite everything, I believe that people are really good at heart." So we give inspiring life writing samples, and then we actually teach some writing techniques. It is writing your life, and the writing in writing your life really has 2 meanings, and one is literally learning to write and tell a good story. So these are some of the principles. And my students know this is my favorite. I say it in every class, and that is, don't tell your story. Don't just say something like, "I experienced a crisis when my father abandoned our family." By showing your story, you invite your classmates and your readers to share the experience, to enter into that experience with you. And by reading it, by hearing it, they actually participate in that. And that's a very profound thing. There are many other writing strategies that help you to do this. Having a good opening. One of my students last year wrote, "I used to hate my mother." And I could hear gasps in the classroom when she said this. And people were really paying attention. And then she went on to reflect on her relationship with her mother and how she came to understand that what she really hated as a teenage girl was her mother's way of showing her that she loved her. So that was quite a profound change in her life. So there's many other techniques, characters, setting, dialogue, pacing. And of course, every writing class will teach you to think about who is your audience. How do you know your audience? And this is also important in our Writing Your Life class. Your audience is your classmates. And how can you share with them things that they might not always understand coming from a very different experience? But finally, the most important audience member for a Writing Your Life class is yourself. So that brings us to the really second most important part of the curriculum. In addition to teaching writing, we're teaching students to think about writing as authorship or agency or responsibility for their own life. So as the writer of your own life, you are the agent. So this is not a new idea. It's been around for a long time. Socrates talked about it and actually drank poison because he used to teach it. I hope they won't make me drink poison. But know thyself, he said, the unreflected life is not worth living. And what we do in class as part of the curriculum is to help students to focus on these different landmarks of their life, things or experiences where they had a profound paradigm shift and they saw that there were other perspectives besides their own, major turning points, critical decisions in their life, or moments of crisis and success. So, for example, I'll share one of the paradigm shifts that one of my students shared with us. And this was her shame at her father's occupation as a construction worker. She told us that she used to lie to her friends and her teachers and say that her dad was an architect because she was so embarrassed that he was a construction worker. And then one night when she was in high school, she was going for a drink of water, and she heard her mother crying, talking to her dad. And they were talking about money problems. And the dad said, well, I'll work more. I'll work longer hours and more days so that we can continue to send her to this good school. And in realizing that he did this work for her, she had this profound paradigm shift where she realized she really was grateful. And so after that, she was very proud to tell her friends and teachers that he was a construction worker. So another example of a kind of turning point one of my students shared was when he took piano lessons for 10 years because he thought his parents wanted him to, and he wanted to make them proud. But in fact, he hated the piano. He couldn't stand it. It was a bit like torture to him. And he kept hoping, okay, I'll learn to like it. But for 10 years, it just became harder and harder as the expectations became higher and higher. And he finally entered a period of mental crisis when at last his dad came to him with tears in his eyes and said, it's really time for us to talk. Well, when his dad learned that his son really didn't like studying the piano, he said, just quit. And your mother and I are fine with that. We want you to be happy and do what you love. And it was astonishing to my student that all along his parents would have been supportive, but for 10 years, they'd never talked about it. So he wrote, despite living together for more than 10 years, deep inside, we had no idea what one another was thinking about. From then on, I've talked much more to my parents. I share all the things that happen and what I've experienced. Sometimes they tell me about their work pressure. I feel we're much closer since that incident. It took a lot of money and time to learn the lesson, but it was all worth it. I've just been so privileged to hear so many wonderful stories like this. I know I don't have time to share too many with you, or they'll drag me off stage. But I just want to say that this has just been such a meaningful part of my lifelong journey. I'm really happy to be able to share it with you. And actually, my experience has just been very personal, very anecdotal. But after teaching it, I began to look around, and I found there's actually quite a lot of research that's been done on this. And it sometimes goes by different names in different professions. Scriptotherapy, for example, that psychologists and counselors recommend writing your life as a way to reflect and understand your situation better. And even in business, they found that such things as what they call after-event reviews can help develop leadership skills. So there's a lot of evidence that this is a very healthy part of lifelong learning. My experience is just anecdotal. I really love the stories of my students. One group came to me after my class and said, "We've been friends for a long time, but we never really knew each other. We never really understood each other until we sat in a class and learned something about who we are." That was very strange for them, but very inspiring. So now they're closer friends than ever. And I also want to say, because we have a very diverse audience today, it's never too late. Lifelong learning is forever. And this is the story of Alfred Nobel, who was the inventor of dynamite. And he made munitions for European armies. Well, when they wrote his obituary before he died, he read it, and it was called "The Merchant of Death is Dead." Dr. Alfred Nobel, who became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before, died yesterday. He didn't like this story of his life, so he rewrote it, and he left his vast fortune to create the Nobel Prizes. And now when we think of Dr. Nobel, we think of the Nobel Peace Prize. So he really made a choice, and he transformed what his life was about. And all of us can do that. So I'd like to just finish with this inspiration from Anne Frank, one of my favorite. And she writes, "And finally I twist my heart round again, so that the bad is on the outside and the good is on the inside. And I keep on trying to find a way of becoming what I would so like to be and could be if there weren't any other people living in the world. The final forming of a person's character lies in their own hands." And so the lifelong learning journey goes on. Thank you.